has a hard-on.
Perfect world is a dream that primitive cerebrals.
He's a tyrant! He's a sadist!
You're all going to die down here.
The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
Welcome past our nightmare, my beloved truth seekers. It's ending one rescue soul spark at a time. From the canyons of drunkenness, amnesia, and nausea, we begin to awaken to our childhood aspirations of staying free and whole in consciousness.
Okay, I'll tell you everything, and you tell me everything, and maybe we can get through all the piss and shit and lies that kill other people.
This is Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis, broadcast from the virtual Alexandria, the dream where East meets West. This is the story of the soul's journey through matter and back to its ancestral kingdom. This is the story of the Gnostics, and therefore your story, when you realize you are a god in the becoming and allow the indwelling Christos to blast through your being like a baby alien. Not just a god, but the biology of the luminaries and aeons of the pleroma, divine personhoods of the all that is everywhere and nowhere, a shower of light through a bubble. Or as one poet once wrote, out of the timeless world shadows fall upon time. From a beauty older than earth, a ladder the soul may climb. I climb by the phantom stair to a whiteness older than time.
Don't act like you're not impressed.
I am, and I am Abraxas, the terrible god above god as the ancients knew him. And heresy should never be this much fun, my beloved truth seekers. Like Meister Eckhart once said, the more we blaspheme, the more we praise God. And it must be noted that the word heresy comes from the Greek to choose. That's what the heretics were in their original context, those who chose a different path than the cemented, barbed wire labyrinths of orthodoxy. And those mazes of orthodoxy are still alive and well today, sewn into the fabric of the universe, in our relationships and family, in our jobs and holy institutions, and deep inside the infections of our egos. The whole system is flawed but gilded enough to keep us down like Michael Vick's dogs.
The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
But as said before, that's why you have come to Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis, to take the road of heresy straight into the divine mind or the alien god of Marcion. And the only way to stay awake and dream at the same time is to experience the knowledge of the heart, gnosis kardias in Greek, or anamnesis, remembering in Greek, until you are no longer bound to the powers and principalities that make up reality itself.
But you're fighting a war you've already lost.
Or as St. Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, for though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine powers to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the gnosis of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to the logos. And just as good, CG Jung once said, dreams are like women. They will have the last word just like they had the first.
Your whole life is just a dream.
And with that, we will dovetail to today's and eternity's topic of perhaps the greatest Gnostic saint of the 20th century, Carl Gustav Jung. Yes, most Heilig and psychic folk think of Jung as one of the founders of psychology, and they are correct. But they merely see a shardling of the Swiss magician's son. In deep esoteric circles, he is the Renaissance man of all things mystical, mythical, and prophetic. And it is my pseudo-humble opinion that once his Red Book is published, he will be recognized as one of the great oracles of the ages.
Anal natrach, urfas bethod, dochiel dienle.
What is the Red Book, you may ask, my beloved truth seekers? Well, it's probably better that our astral guests give us a cavalcade into the amazing personality and persona that was C.G. Jung. I doubt there are any other scholars who not only know Jung, but truly understand him better other than Stephan Hoeller, author of the Gnostic Jung and the 7 Sermons to the Dead, Gnosticism, New Light on the Ancient Tradition of Inner Knowing, Jung and the Lost Gospels, and Freedom, Alchemy for a Voluntary Society.
Thanks. I was running short on platitudes. You can leave now.
In fact, I'd like to go into Dr. Hoeller before C.G. Jung because his presence and mettle are almost as impressive as the Swiss magicians, and their essence and paths are very intertwined. Dr. Hoeller is probably the greatest champion and revealer of Gnosticism in the latter part of the 20th century. Since a child in Hungary, he writes about how the Gnostics gripped his young imagination. Through the invasion of the Nazis and subsequently the Soviets, through his journey throughout Europe and escape until he finally came to the shores of America, and all the way today as the bishop of the Ecclesia Gnostica in L.A., Dr. Hoeller has fought not only for his freedom, but the freedom and choice for us to understand the Gnostics, Gnosticism, and Gnosis.
There are, of course, those who do not want us to speak.
The old gentleman has never faltered in his vigor for the old heretics, and his contributions are an earthquake to the stubborn intellectual lands owned by Jehovah and his angelic mafia.
Dance with the devil don't change. Devil changes you.
Like Jeremy Puma last week, he is both a Gnostic and a Gnostic scholar, as well as also being versed in other esoteric arts. Dr. Hoeller is unapologetic, wise as a snake, and often controversial. He has raised as many eyebrows as he has human spirits. But you can't make an enlightened omelet without breaking a few eggheads posing as lovers of the mystical.
You're pathetic, just so you know.
And perhaps the best quality he has is his solar sense of humor. Laughter, after all, is an essential part of Gnosis. As the Buddha said, one must joyfully participate in the suffering of the world. Make the best of it because sooner or later they will come for you to be crucified. It's all fun and games until someone loses a third eye. And that's why the Gnostic Jesus laughs in our Gospels, and the Orthodox Jesus cries out to a God that hates him as much as he hates us.
Crucifixion lasts hours. It's a slow, horrible death.
Well, at least it gets you out in the open air.
I've met Dr. Hoeller a few times at the Theosophical Society in Chicago, as well as had the pleasure of sitting through a Gnostic Mass with him at the charge. His knowledge was refreshing as it was pedantic, but once Sophia entered his consciousness, what came out of his lips was manna from the place beyond heaven we Gnostics call the pleroma, or the fullness of the divine. So I urge you to read some of his books. His best one, I believe with confidence, is Jung and the 7 Sermons to the Dead. Not only do we get into the stormy heart of what seems to be the stoic gentleman called Carl Jung, we also are privy to Hoeller's timeless words on the condition of mankind and its attempt to escape the world of insane, petulant illusions.
Hey, what'd you do to the world?
Turned it off.
Then I would recommend Gnosticism, New Light on the Ancient Tradition of Inner Knowing, which I would call a 1,000 level course on all you need to know about the Gnostics, Gnosticism, and Gnosis. Another great pathway into both Jung and Hoeller is the website bcrecordings.net. Again, that's bcrecordings.net. There you can download several lectures and sermonettes of Dr. Hoeller, including hour after hour on all things C.G. Jung.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
If you're short on cash, worry not, my beloved truth seekers, because there are several lectures that you can download for free. You can also go to gnosis.org and peruse many of his captivating essays or listen to various lectures directly from your computer. Unfortunately, you'll need real player. Never liked it. And if you live in or close to LA or ever are there, Hoeller does weekly classes and lectures. Just go to gnosis.org for the eternal schedule.
Let's go spread some freedom.
So what I'm getting to is that basically you can't know Jung without Hoeller, and you can't know Hoeller without Jung. Hell, even CG Jung admitted that he was a terrible writer. And of course, German sometimes just doesn't translate well in English. So even if you don't buy into Hoeller, please start by reading about Jung before you delve directly into Jung. That's my advice for what it's worth. Take it or leave it. You're going to die alone anyway.
Remember what I said about seeing a light when you're dying? It ain't true. I can't see a damn thing.
And yes, we are the Gnostics, the strangers, or allogenes in Greek. Just like the Gnostic Jesus and the fallen Sophia, the lost wisdom of God. We are sailing in the seas of fate through the gnashing rocks of orthodoxy, towards the farthest shore Ursula Le Guin wrote about in her Earthsea trilogy.
When someone asks you if you're a god, you say, yes!
We are the Gnostics, but in my drivel you might still not grasp the Gnostics who are also your story. Perhaps someone much wiser can shed light into the light of your trapped soul. This is the Gnostic Master Theodotus, who wrote that Gnosis is the knowledge of who we were, what we have become, where we were, whereinto we have been thrown, whither we hasten, whence we are redeemed, what is birth and what is rebirth. Check off that list every day and you'll be fine, my beloved true seekers. You'll be fine. Dr. Stephan Hoeller on Carl Jung on coffee, cigarettes, and Gnosis.
We've all been raised on television to believe that one day we'd all be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars, but we won't. We're slowly learning that fact. We're very, very pissed off. Yeah.
The middle children of history, man. No purpose or place. We have no great war, no great depression. Our great war is a spiritual war. Our great depression is our lives.
Because we do not know when we will die, we get to think of life as an inexhaustible well. And yet everything happens only a certain number of times, and a very small number, really. How many more times will you remember a certain afternoon of your childhood, an afternoon that is so deeply a part of your being that you can't even conceive of your life without it? Perhaps 4 or 5 times more, perhaps not even that. How many more times will you watch the full moon rise? Perhaps 20, and yet it all seems limitless.
This is the Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis interview. With us today we have Dr. Hoeller, who, as I mentioned in the introduction, has written quite a body of work that has shaped Gnosticism as we know it. How are you doing today, Dr. Hoeller?
Oh, quite well, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for giving us your time to discuss one of the most, if not the most important Gnostic figure of the 20th century, CG Jung. But before we get into the Gnosis of Jung, could you give us a brief summary of Jung's life before and how he got into depth psychology?
Yes, certainly. Jung was born in the last quarter of the 19th century in 1875, and he was one of the 3 great figures of depth psychology, of course, along with Sigmund Freud and Alfred Adler. He was a medical doctor who specialized in what today we call psychiatry. At that time, I guess he would have been called an alienist. But he had a deep interest in the sort of the secret. Or what later on would have been called the unconscious side of the human mind and the human endeavors from the time that he was very young. He also studied in his youth everything that was available at that time about Gnosticism, and was very, very well informed about the the esoteric side of spirituality. So he came to depth psychology once he met Sigmund Freud, subsequent to about the year 1900, when Freud published his book on the interpretation of dreams. That was one of his great books that everybody became interested in. And so Jung brought a somewhat different orientation to depth psychology. Jung was the son of a Protestant minister in Switzerland, and he was deeply involved in religion from the time that he was a child, although he had very little use for the kind of organized religion that he found in his father's church, but he was interested in spirituality, shall we say. And that is what he brought then to depth psychology. He died in 1961, and in the meantime he founded a major school of depth psychology, which then had always various connections and liaisons with unconventional spirituality, including Gnosticism. That's probably about as much of the basic background that one needs to have.
You said that C.G. Jung and Sigmund Freud were very close. Didn't they have a falling out?
Oh yes, they certainly did. They were close for about a dozen years, maybe a little longer. And in 1913, Jung published a book which came to be known later on as Symbols of Transformation. There he had put forth quite a number of ideas which Freud couldn't stomach. And so that really caused their break, and from then on they represented two separate schools. The interesting background behind that break really was that Jung was receiving, as it were, information of a depth psychological or depth psychological related nature from sources that Freud was deeply suspicious of. And these sources were of a mystical nature. Between about 1912 or thereabouts and 1916, Jung underwent a sort of big spiritual transformation in his own life, in his own mind. And in the course of those experiences, he received all sorts of information which he integrated into his depth psychological teachings. And the first publication of that occurred in about 1913, and that is when they came to a parting of the ways. Freud was a dyed-in-the-wool materialist and atheist, and of course Jung had very different orientation.
And at what point did Jung become interested in the Gnostics, or when did he run into the Gnostics?
Oh, his Gnostic interests go way back before his connections with Freud, already when he was in his early 20s or thereabouts. Of course, there wasn't as much material available on the Gnostics at that time as there is now, because the famous Nag Hammadi discovery has not occurred yet. That didn't occur till 1945. But Jung read pretty much everything that was available, and that was available in translations at that time. So he had a strong background in Gnosticism quite early in life, and his interest in that subject continued till the end of his life.
You also mentioned in your book the Gnostic Jung and the Seven Sermons to the Dead, that wasn't Schopenhauer a big influence on Gnosticism?
Oh yes. Well, of course, Schopenhauer was a major German philosopher, of idealistic philosopher, had an outlook, you might say, a worldview that in many ways was quite compatible with Gnosticism. So Jung was influenced certainly by Schopenhauer. Jung was influenced by Nietzsche and by the German idealists And all of those, however, had put forth teachings, at least the ones that Jung was greatly interested in, that were related to, were quite compatible with Gnosticism.
And what exactly about Gnosticism intrigued him so much?
Oh, I think that quite a number of elements, but probably they could be summed up in the notion that Gnosticism was or is really a sort of psychological religion. In other words, all the figures and elements that conventional religiosity postulates as existing outside of the human psyche, God, angels, saints, Virgin Mary, things like that, all of that is out there and all of that is in heaven as far as mainstream Christianity, for instance, is concerned. The Gnostics always recognized that, at least in part, if not entirely, all of these powers and figures of religion really exist deeply within the human soul itself. And so we can discover, let's say, the realities of the transcendental worlds by looking deeply within ourselves. And that is certainly a very different orientation from mainstream religiosity or whatever kind, and that made the Gnostic approach to spirituality far more acceptable to a depth psychological view than any of the others.
And also, as you've mentioned in many of your lectures, didn't Jung believe that the Gnostics had the best answer to the question of evil?
Oh, absolutely, yes. Yes, that of course was a big element. It was a very important feature. And the notion that evil exists as a sort of spiritual force in itself and isn't merely the absence of good, as a lot of Christian theology defined it, was very important to Jung. And Jung then, of course, developed his own psychological teachings about what is generally referred to as the shadow. And the shadow is the dark, the unlived, unexpressed, and sometimes evil side of the human unconscious. But he felt that this personal shadow of the human being in turn is rooted in yet deeper forces, which are of a ultimately of a collective or metaphysical dimension, and sort of the personal shadow of the human links up with the universal shadow, with the universal darkness, which is again in essence very much of a Gnostic teaching.
For the listener who might not be that familiar with Jung, could you explain a little bit about his concept of the archetypes? I believe Plato was the one who mentioned first.
Yeah, the concept of the archetypes in a philosophical sense goes back to Plato, although Jung had said that his own formulation of the archetypes had much more in common with a Jewish Platonic philosopher of the Alexandria period, right around I think the 1st century or so, Philo of Alexandria. And it has to do, initially philosophically, it has to do with the notion that there are primordial images of various aspects of reality which exist in a sort of metaphysical realm, what maybe the religionist would call in the mind of God, and that earthly things, created things, are the reflections of these. That was Plato's view, and Jung modified this in a psychological fashion, indicating that there are images, archetypal images and powers deeply within the human psyche, which were always there, which are of a collective nature, so that we inherit, as it were, from the human race certain archetypal images which are not of our own making, and that these images then come and perform various functions within the psyche, in the conscious mind. So it's the archetypes are a sort of a link, you might say, between a metaphysical, transcendental or collective reality and our own human psyche. The way Jung said that he came to that recognition, in fact, was when he was working in a mental hospital in Switzerland as a young resident doctor, and a mental patient there came and gave him an elaborate description of a kind of fantasy that this deranged gentleman had about the sun, and the sun had a sort of a tube hanging from it, and from this tube in a certain way came the winds of north, west, and south, and east. And right about that time, Jung had also received a very recent translation of an ancient ritual, a Mitraic ritual from the Mysteries of Mitra, that gave exactly that same mythological image. So here was a man who had no contact with these ancient sources, so probably couldn't even read or not much, who had that exact same image. And so Jung said, well, there are some of these great mythological images that are always in the background there in the human mind, and they are the collective heritage of humanity, and that these are the archetypes.
Dr. Hoeller, could you maybe explain a little bit about his concept of synchronicity? What did he develop? Was he the first person to develop this?
Yes, he, as far as we know, at least under that name and in this fashion, Jung was the one who discovered the principle of synchronicity, which of course is related to the concept of the archetypes. Synchronicity is still a rather mysterious subject. Jung himself could not, I think, give it a very detailed, a very concrete expression, because it's a pretty mysterious principle. But it has to do with the notion that when an archetypal force, an archetype is rising in our own minds, rising toward consciousness, a corresponding image of some sort will call attention to itself in the outer world, so that an inner event and an outer event will appear to our minds, to our perception, together in time. That's what synchronicity means, at the same time. And by doing so, they reinforce our perception of and our connection with this kind of archetypal revelation. And so synchronicity then has a relationship to a lot of spontaneous kind of paranormal borderline phenomena that people encounter, such as in parapsychology, but it also has a relationship to divination, such as the I Ching, the Chinese book of changes, of which Jung was very conversant with, and he was very fond of it, because the divinatory modalities, I Ching, Tarot, astrology, various others, are, you might say, contrived agencies of synchronicity. That is the way that we make synchronicities happen, and they reveal something about our psyche and therefore also about our fate.
Going to his one blatantly Gnostic work, could you tell us why CG Jung decided to write the 7 Sermons to the Dead?
Well, I think I mentioned a few minutes ago that in that period of time between about 1912 or 1913 and 1916, Jung underwent a large number of internal experiences of a very powerful, very transformative nature. He was seeing visions all the time and having these inner experiences, and he wrote them down, or at least he wrote many of them down, primarily in a private book of his, which was not published, which they refer to as the Red Book, because it was the manuscript he had bound in red leather. And this Red Book contains a great deal of really mysterious sort of esoteric information, as well as illustrations that Jung drew himself. There was only one portion of that material toward the end of the writing of the Red Book in 1916, which Jung allowed to sort of come out, not exactly into the public, but which he published actually privately and distributed to a number of his friends in 1916 when he wrote it, and that is the 7 Sermons to the Dead, which he actually acknowledged as being the source myth, so to say, the initial imagery of much of Jung's psychology itself. And that is the 7 Sermons to the Dead, which is written entirely in Gnostic terminology, and which he sort of poetically attributed to one of the great Gnostic teachers of the 2nd or early 3rd century, Basilides. Now, what is rather interesting is that the 7 Sermons to the Dead has been known now for some time, pretty much since the period after Jung's death, about 61, 62, around that time, because it was included in some of the editions of his autobiographical fragments, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And I myself then, thereafter, in the 60s, have written an interpretation of it, which is called the Gnostic Jung and the 7 Sermons to the Dead. But now there is a major development about to take place, because the Red Book, which has been kept secret all of this time by the Jung family, is about to be published and translated in its entirety. And the latest information is that it is due to be released in, I believe, February of next year, of 78. So now we will have a much more material available to us of the nature, basic nature of the 7 Sermons, only much more of it, from Jung's pen. And I think it will be a major development that especially students of Jung and of his teachings will greatly appreciate.
Do we have any leaks at all? Anything on the internet about it, or is everything hush-hush?
No, it's not hush-hush at this time, except I couldn't tell you exactly as to what web page you would find it on, but I suppose that if you Google it, if you institute a search and look for Jung and look for Red Book, then you would probably find some material. There is a Jungian psychologist in England of, I think, Indian origin, Dr. Sunu Shabdasamy, who is the general editor. In fact, he has been in the United States a number of times lecturing about this too. I'm sure that there are some notices, indications about the publication, and maybe to some extent what it contains already on the internet. Mm-hmm.
But you mentioned, Dr. Hoeller, that he went through a lot of internal visions, but from what you write, it wasn't just something internal. I mean, there was a lot of paranormal occurrences during this, wasn't there?
Oh yes. Well, again, in the light, say, of Jung's teachings of synchronicity, it is fairly common occurrence that when somebody's deep psyche, what Jung calls the collective unconscious, is stirred up, so to say, and is manifesting, that this will also then be synchronistically correlated with paranormal occurrences around that person in the external world. So, for instance, just a little example of that being that in 1916, when the 7 Sermons to the Dead came to Jung, the way it started out was that various kind of occult events took place in Jung's house, and then that culminated in an occurrence wherein some powerful knocks were heard at the front door, like somebody was really hitting the front door very powerfully, and Jung went to the door, and there was no one outside the door, but he heard the voice saying, "We have come from Jerusalem where we have not found what we were seeking," which is the first line of the 7 Sermons. And then he went back into the house and started writing the 7 Sermons. He felt that it was like a group of spirits who had entered the house when he opened the house in response to that knocking. So there were all kinds of things of that sort going on, but you have to understand that this does not necessarily indicate that Jung was, say, channeling from an external, objective external spirit, but it's much more mysterious than that. It comes, at least in large portion from the deeper psyche of the individual, but it also links up with some universal forces. So it's not that kind of simplistic spiritualistic model that you find among channelers and mediums, but it's a much more complex situation.
Yes, I have heard your lectures, Dr. Hoeller, and I know your opinion on channelers as much as I know your opinion on vegetarians. But why do you think he picked Basilides of all the Gnostic masters?
That's kind of hard to pinpoint, but my opinion is, but it's only an opinion, that at the time when Jung was writing this, that is probably 1916 or shortly thereafter, much of the existing literature about the old Gnostics said or implied that the Gnostic teacher Basilides was the primary one who wrote about a mythological figure, Gnostic mythological figure named Abraxas. So they connected the figure of Abraxas with Basilides. And since the 7 Sermons to the Dead have, one of the sermons is entirely devoted to Abraxas, one of the 7, then Jung sort of poetically attributed the treatise of the 7 Sermons to Basilides because Basilides was connected with Abraxas. We now have found, however, as the result of Nag Hammadi and others, that Abraxas is mentioned in other sources as well. And at the same time, we don't really have much in terms of the writings of Basilides that are available. We only have accounts of them. But I think that's why he picked Basilides.
And going back to paranormal, is there any truth to the rumor that in his red book, his handwriting actually changed?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. This is known and has been known for a long time, that when he wrote the red book, his handwriting changed, and it's sort of almost like a handwriting of an archaic nature. It's like old German type of writing, and that's the only place where he used it was in the red book. and none of his other manuscripts, his psychological, after all, has 18 volumes of his collected writings. He was a prolific writer. None of the manuscripts of his other writings had that handwriting. This is true. So that's also an indication of a highly altered state of consciousness by whatever means and in whatever fashion.
And after he wrote the 7 Sermons of the Dead, you write how it somehow got leaked. But didn't he receive a lot of heat from it, especially from the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, who mentioned
Buber became especially hostile. What happened was that Jung had privately printed a certain number of these books, the 7 Sermons to the Dead. I have a copy of it myself, which was sent to me with an inscription by Jung's son, Franz Jung, who is now himself deceased. He was the senior offspring of Carl Jung and the head of the family after Carl Jung's death, but he has died a few years ago in his 80s himself. But when I managed to send a German translation of my book on the 7 Sermons to the Dead to him, he then, in recognition of my effort, sent me an original copy of Jung's privately printed book on the 7 Sermons, which I have in a glass case and I treasure greatly, along with Franz Jung's letter, because Franz Jung wrote to me in German and he said that as far as he was concerned, I represented the teachings, the philosophy of his father with utmost accuracy, and this I value very, very highly. So one of those books had come to into the hands or to the attention of Martin Buber through somebody else, and then Buber got very excited and very annoyed and called Jung a heretic and a Gnostic in a manner which was not very complimentary to Jung. Apparently, Buber had a certain rather inaccurate view of the Gnostics at that time, and I suspect that Buber connected Gnostics quite without any real justification with the Nazis, and things like that, with anti-Semitism. And therefore he was very exercised over the 7 Sermons to the Dead, but it didn't really harm Jung all that much. The issue is that in the Gnostic teachings, in many of the Gnostic writings, the God of the Old Testament, Jehovah, the God of the Jews, is represented as an intermediate kind of deity who is not the true and ultimate Godhead, but a demiurge, as the Greek term has it. And that, of course, made Buber, who was an Orthodox Jew, very angry. He became very put out over that. Mm-hmm. So anybody who associates himself with Gnostics, therefore, must be anti-Semitic and must be a bad person. That was kind of the story of Buber and Jung.
But Jung never actually ever admitted he was a Gnostic to anybody.
Well, no, not in those words. But for instance, say one of his disciples, Barbara Hanna, who wrote one biography of Jung, mentioned that Jung said to her in person that when he discovered the Gnostics, that means, of course, the writings, he immediately felt that he was among old friends. And utterances of that sort are reported in many, many of his biographies. So he did not identify himself as a Gnostic at his time, but he acknowledged a great deal of interest in and respect for and even an affinity with the ancient Gnostics. So he didn't have to say that he was a Gnostic. And also at that time there were no Gnostics really around in the, prior to the 1960s in the world much who acknowledged that they were Gnostics. So Jung did not call himself a Gnostic. That is true.
And he wasn't just interested in Gnosticism. Wasn't he very interested in other esoteric pursuits like alchemy and the Kabbalah?
Oh, yeah. Of course, his interest in alchemy, which was certainly a major one, and then he authored 3 major books on alchemy. One of them being called Psychology and Alchemy, the other one being called anyway, two more, Alchemical Studies being another one, and then there's a third one, Mysterium Conjunctionis. Those are the 3 ones. It took up a good segment of his later life, his interest in alchemy and his writings about it and his lectures about it and so forth. But Jung definitely said that alchemy was a later development of Gnosticism. That the Gnostics, when they had to go out of business, so to say, because of the persecutions of the Christian church, had funneled their symbolism, their teachings, they disguised their teachings under the symbolism of alchemy. So really, in a sense, Jung's interest in alchemy was an extension of his interest in Gnosticism. Now, but of course he was interested in other things too. He was interested in Taoism and the Chinese oracle of I Ching, and that was an important interest of his, and other esoteric and mystical subjects as well. Yeah.
Yeah, didn't he carry with him always a copy of the Zohar?
Yes, a German translation of or it's actually a translation into Latin, I think, of the Zohar by Knorr von Rosenroth. He valued that very highly. That is called the Kabbalah Denudata, the Kabbalah Revealed. That was one of the early books on Kabbalah. And he did value that book highly, and when he was traveling, and so he always took it with him. Of course, one of the great authorities, in fact, the first great authority in the 20th century, I would say, on Kabbalah, Gershon Scholem, had actually defined Kabbalah as Jewish Gnosticism. So you see, again, the connection is always there with the Gnostics.
And what about Dr. Hoeller's famous Gnostic ring? Where did he find this?
Oh, the Gnostic ring?
Yes.
Well, he didn't find that. He had that one made.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, he had it made on the basis of pre-existing designs of Gnostic gems, of Gnostic stones, which had been found at various historical periods in Egypt. And so he had a jeweler make this one for him according to his own design, which he gave. Now, I imagine that he could have procured and purchased an original Gnostic stone, because they are around, and they were around then. I have a beautiful one which I had made into a ring recently, was given to me on the occasion of my birthday about a year ago, and I had it put in a setting.
Wow.
So, and that is from the 3rd century. It's a priceless object. But Jung apparently wanted the specific design that he could relate to. And so he had that ring made for himself. It's quite a large ring, a large stone, and he wore it always.
Right. And so what, using your crystal ball, what do you think will happen after the publication of the Red Book? Do you think he'll finally be considered or proven as a Gnostic Master, or will there be another revival?
Well, of course, one cannot predict those things with any degree of accuracy, but it will certainly reveal Jung as a mystic, as an esotericist, as someone who had, highly unusual revelatory experiences from other than ordinary sources. And no doubt there will be a great deal of Gnostic and Gnostic-related material there. So I would say it will not necessarily establish Jung as a Gnostic master, pure and simple, at least not in the ancient sense, but I think it will establish Jung as a primarily spiritual figure. And it may detract to some degree from his stature as a scientist, as people understand it, because in the minds of the somewhat materialistic people, you can't be a scientist and you can't be a spiritual figure at the same time. It's one or the other.
Right.
So this will tilt the balance over toward the spiritual side, I think, very, very heavily. And this may even be inconvenient to a lot of Jungian psychologists who, of course, make their living by therapy and by analysis, and they may be afraid that when Jung is revealed as a primarily spiritual figure, people are going to say, well, we don't want people, therapists who are that spiritual. We want therapists who are just therapists.
Right.
And that they may lose some of their livelihood that way. So I think there's going to be a division in the Jungian community among those who appreciate Jung as a spiritual figure and want more of that. They want more of those teachings and images and visions and so forth, and those who don't. And then it may also call attention to Jung as a sort of a spiritual prophetic figure in the general public, because there is interest in the general public in that, of course, always. So it will be very interesting to see which way things are going to go with the figure of Jung now, and whether there will be a revival of interest in Jung and a re-evaluation perhaps of many of his previously published writings or not. But I think there will be a revival.
Well, let's hope so. Well, time, unfortunately, is our enemy here in the airways, but
yes.
But I wanted to mention to the listeners that we've talked about Jung, but Dr. Hoeller has hours and hours of wonderful lectures on Jung. All you have to do is go to www.bcrecordings.net. Again, that's www.bcrecordings.net, or called 323-465-9282. You can download these lectures, and I have two, and they've definitely widened my perspective. But I think that's about it today. I want to thank you for coming on Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis.
Well, all the best to you, and I hope to talk to you soon.
Yes, we will see you at the end of September at the Theosophical Society.
I certainly hope so. All the best to you. Thanks very much.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
have a good day.
Thank you.
The dead came back from Jerusalem, where they found not what they sought. They prayed me, let them in, and besought my word, and thus I began my teaching. At one point I spoke to them about Abraxas. There is a god whom ye knew not, for mankind forgot it. We name it by its name, Abraxas. It is more indefinite still than God and devil. Abraxas is effect. Nothing standeth opposed to it but the ineffective. Hence its affected nature freely unfoldeth itself. The ineffective is not, therefore resist it not. Abraxas standeth above the sun and above the devil. It is improbable probability, unreal reality. Had the pleroma a being, Abraxas would be its manifestation. It is the effect itself, nor any particular effect, but effect in general. It is unreal reality, because it hath no definite effect. It is also a creature, because it is distinct from the pleroma. The sun hath a definite effect, and so hath the devil. Wherefore do they appear to us more effective than indefinite Abraxas? It is force, duration, change. The dead now raised a great tumult, for they were Christians. Sermon number 3. Like mists arising from a marsh, the dead came near and cried, Speak further unto us concerning the supreme God. Hard to know is the deity of Abraxas. Its power is the greatest, because man perceiveth it not. From the God he draweth the ultimate good, and from the devil the infinite evil. But from Abraxas, life, altogether indefinite, the mother of good and evil. Smaller and weaker life seemeth to be than the ultimate good. Wherefore is it also hard to conceive Abraxas transcendent even God in power, who is himself the radiant source of all force of life. Abraxas is God, and at the same time the eternally sucking gorge of the void, the belittling and dismembering devil. The power of Abraxas is twofold, but ye see it not, because for your eyes the warning opposites of this power are extinguished. What the God speaketh is life, what the devil speaketh is death. But Abraxas speaketh that hallowed and accursed word, which is life and death at the same time. Abraxas begetteth truth and lie, good and evil, light and darkness, in the same word and in the same act. Wherefore is Abraxas terrible, it is splendid as the lion in the instant he striketh down his victim. It is beautiful as day in the spring. It is the great Pan himself, and also the small one. It is Priapos. It is the monster of the underworld, 1,000-armed polyp, coiled knot of winged serpents frenzy. It is the hermaphrodite of the earliest beginning. It is the lord of the toads and frogs, which live in the water and gets up on the land, whose chorus ascendeth at noon and at midnight. It is abundance that seeketh union with emptiness. It is holy begetting. It is love and love's murder. It is the saint and his betrayer. It is the brightest light of day and the darkest night of madness. To look upon it is blindness. To know it is sickness. To worship it is death. To fear it is wisdom. To resist it not is redemption. God dwelleth behind the sun, the devil behind the night. What God bringeth forth out the light, the devil sucketh into the night. But Abraxas is the world, its becoming and its passing. Upon every gift that cometh from God, the devil layeth his curse. Everything that ye entreat from the God begetteth the deed from the devil. Everything that ye create with the God giveth effect, power to the devil. That is terrible Abraxas. It is the mightiest creature, and in it the creature is afraid of itself. It is the manifest opposition to the pleroma and its nothingness. It is the son's horror of the mother. It is the mother's love for the son. It is the delight of the earth and the cruelty of the heavens. Before its countenance man becometh like stone. Before it there is no question and no reply. It is the effect of every creature. It is the operation of distinctness. It is the love of man. It is the speech of man. It is the appearance and the shadow of man. It is illusory reality. Now the dead howled and raged, for they were unperfected.